Welcome to the Brewers Weekly Rundown Podcast, a production of the Flicksation Podcast Network.
Brewers down to their final out now. Now up to Christian Yelich. Here it is. Yelich sends one to right center and deep. Get up! Get up! Get out of here and gone for Yelich. He has tied the game with a booming home run. He got it all.
Hey everybody, welcome back. You have got the Brewers Weekly Rundown Podcast. How are you doing? My name is Eric Madsen. I'm here at Flicksation Studios, P City, Wisco. I am joined once again by the good Dr. Will Flanders from the Milwaukee area. Will, welcome back, man.
Good evening. Thanks for having me on again.
I see you spent the weekend at a sporting event, as a matter of fact.
We did. It was it's been so long. I was trying to think the last sporting event I've been to, and I think it was the Packers game that I took my girlfriend to back in against the Panthers, and I think that was a November game. So I think it's been since then since we've been to any sort of like a major sporting event. But we did go up to Road America for the IndyCar weekend, and I know I saw some comments on TV that people aren't social distancing and people aren't wearing masks, but I thought overall it was a pretty decent job, and no one was people were actually pretty considerate and distancing to some extent at a big outdoor event. So it was a good experience. And, the way things are going, I tried to sort of soak it all in as maybe the only sporting event I might get to see this year. So I tried to enjoy that as much as possible.
All right. So you kind of started it there. Before we get started, like I said on the last show, I'll give folks an opportunity at the top of each show to talk about COVID-related things, whatever's on their mind or whatever. I think a lot of times, especially when it's me and you here, Will, we probably won't even talk about it too much because I'm just trying to keep it out of my mind. But yeah, it's been a few weeks since we've had you on. Where are your thoughts? I mean, I think we're all pretty sure the season's going to start at this point. Prognosis good, you think, for making it through, or where are you sitting?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think a month ago, in general, things were kind of looking better across the country. Cases were steady and maybe slightly dropping. Deaths were actually going down quite substantially. And as everyone knows, we don't need to rehash the news here, right? But we've certainly seen an uptick in recent weeks, setting case records on a regular basis. And the deaths are kind of trending in the wrong direction again as well. So given that this was the time of year that we thought would be the best, even all the forecasts back in March said that maybe we'll see a substantial downturn in summer, and then fall is where things will get bad again. I'm nervous about it. I mean, I'll admit that. I mean, when we got to the starting point, and I think once it gets going, there'll be some inertia that sort of maybe can keep it going, unless we see whole teams getting infected. I think the NBA and the NHL have a pretty good shot of getting their seasons completed. Because of the bubble idea. Even though the NBA's in Florida, if they can actually keep that bubble going, I've already heard some folks that some players that aren't quite keeping it as solid as they should. But I think that model could be pretty effective.
Must be some really good pizza or whatever the hell he went for.
Exactly. Not sure that was actually what he went for. That's the story we got publicly, at least. But so I think that's a model that's likely to be successful. But once we saw the schedule and the fact that we're going to be not doing 5-game series, we're going to be doing this sort of uneven schedule where we are going to be taking multiple trips to every city. What
do you think, Will? Why did they go that way? That makes no sense to me. I was totally expecting 5-game series here.
I have yet to hear a good explanation for why that was the case. I guess, in general, they're hesitant to do 5-game series, right? Because you get too much of a single team. You go through the entire 5-man pitching staff. But in a year like this where everything is odd anyway, we're playing a 60-game season for God's sake, right? There's nothing normal about this year. I think that would have been a reasonable way to limit the amount of travel, limit the opportunities for people to be exposed in
save
travel.
A few bucks on travel, for God's
exactly.
sake.
That as well. It's a good point as well. So I don't know why they did that, and even less do I understand the 7-3 splits that we have in some of these cases that we can, potentially discuss a little bit later on. If I was betting, if I was a betting person, I think I'd still bet that we will get it in, because I think, once it gets going, like I said, the inertia will keep it to the finish. And once we get to the playoffs, you can make the argument it's fewer and fewer, players on a weekly basis that are involved. Which is kind of the argument the NBA has made initially, right? You're sort of paring it down over time, so it's less and less potential exposure. So I think if we get started, which at this point all systems seem to be go, I'd still bet on us getting it done. A lot of folks doubted that we even get the season started. There was some discussion here, and it turns out that Manfred was willing to sort of use his final trump card there, and force the season to happen. And I think that's an indication that barring some crazy, return to New York City around the entire country, the New York City conditions from back in, the couple months ago I'm talking about, I think that there's a good likelihood we'll finish.
Yeah, I hope you are right for sure. All right, so before we move on, let's tell you how you can get a hold of the show here, brewersrundown@gmail.com. You can call or text our voicemail line anytime, 24/7 at 608-535-9302. If you do leave a voicemail, let us know if you don't want us playing it on the show. On Twitter and Instagram at Brewers Weekly, or follow us on Facebook. Facebook and Twitter are probably the two things that you'll see the most social interaction out of us on. It looks like we've got a good number of new listeners here, as the baseball season actually looks like it's getting started this time. So hello to all you new folks out there getting into the show. Thank you. We hope you hang around. All right, I think tonight Will and I are going to talk some pitching here first, and then we're going to go through the draft a little bit, the Brewers' 5 draft picks from the 2020 draft. So overall, Will, just before we kind of start breaking down the rotation and the bullpen, what do you think of the Brewers pitching staff as a whole going through here? We talked last week about how ready some of these guys are. We've been seeing these simulated games. Just the other day, Woodruff pitched 70 innings, 70 innings.
That'd be pretty impressive.
That is good. 70 pitches in 5 innings. And it's a situational thing, so it's not exactly a real game, but he threw that number of pitches. Counsel had said he thought Woodruff was pretty much up to 90 at this point. They're not going to get 90 out of him in a simulated game, but Josh Lindblom's supposedly in similar shape. Corey Knebel says he's ready to go very strongly. I'm pretty sure he heard this podcast last week, because he shortly after that came out and told everybody that, yep, I'm ready. It's time to go. So hopefully that's the case. Anyway, these pitchers are supposedly in pretty good shape here, Will. So overall, just what do you think the pitching staff looks like this year?
Yeah, so I watched the simulated game that they had on tonight. And Woodruff was on an 80 pitch count. It was interesting seeing him going up against Yelich and striking him out 3 times. So according to Yelich, Woodruff is 100% ready. He looked really good out there today, mixing in all of his pitches. There was 1 home run that he gave up, but that was really his only mistake of the whole outing. And he got into the 5th inning, I think, before he was pulled. So didn't quite get through the 5th this time. But no, Woodruff looks ready. He's looking more and more like he could develop into an ace of the staff. More so than just the Brewers' best pitcher, but an actual solid ace of the staff. You don't want to base too much, as you said, on these summer camp or new spring training games. But certainly looking good in that regard. Looking more globally at the pitching staff, I think we've seen historically that Counsell is really good at managing the pitching staff in September. And what do we have in September? We have the expanded rosters. What are we going to have to start the year? We're going to have expanded rosters. And one key other change that's coming this year is that there's no limit now on the number of pitchers that can be on your roster. So I expect that in many circumstances the Brewers may have more than the 13 pitchers on the roster. We might see 14 potentially, or maybe even 15 on some days. And we know that Craig is not afraid to make use of all of those arms if they're needed. And I think that what we've seen over the past couple of years, he's really good at doing that. And so the ability to mix and match is back, more so than it was going to be under the the previous rules that we would have started in April with. And I think that's playing to the Brewers' strength. Is we don't necessarily have a ton of guys that are lights out, but we have a ton of guys that are great in situational type environments. And I think that's maybe playing to the Brewers' strength here. So I think the Brewers can benefit from these rules changes that have occurred for the 60-game season for sure. And it actually makes the pitching staff look better.
So the rotation here, I think, and this is weird too, because I don't know if they're gonna go with 4 guys. Are they gonna go with 5 guys? Are they gonna go with 6-guy rotation in this 60-game season? It could go a number of ways. We'll just give it the benefit of the doubt and say it's the 5-man rotation. Do you agree that the top 4 slots are locks here, Will, with Anderson, Woodruff, Hauser, and Lindblom, and then it's up in the air kind of after that?
I think so. With what I've seen anecdotally and looking at some of the stats from the summer camp as well as going back to spring, I think those guys are pretty much set. What we kind of hoped and what we talked about on the early days of the podcast here was Freddie Peralta's progress and the hope that he could sort of slot in and become almost a number 2, with the new contract and the progress that he made in winter ball. I think we've seen sort of a regression to some extent to the Freddie of the past, so that's a little bit concerning. But I think in terms of the top 4, I think you're right. I think those are the guys that we'll see. I think Lauer's been out. Is that right? Lauer's been out with the COVID stuff, right?
He's asymptomatic. Actually, he tested negative, but he was in direct contact with, it was his wife or somebody close enough to him where he's stuck basically where I am right now. So
that's right.
It's probably in the same days and all that other stuff too. So and then he'll have protocol coming in and all that stuff. So
yeah. So the question
it's
there
be a
is
couple of weeks into the season probably.
Yeah, that's right. So the question is there, will that sort of get him pushed out at the beginning, maybe into bullpen role to begin the year, just to get some innings in, to the extent he's not able to come back before. But we still have a good number of days, and if he's following the track that we've seen with some of these other players, I expect maybe he'll be able to be back pretty soon. Of course, there's tremendous variation with this stuff in terms of how long it takes to get a negative test and meeting all of the protocol. So there's the question is whether he'll be quite prepared. But I think by a couple weeks into the season, you certainly would expect to see him slotting into the rotation for sure.
Just off my head right now, I probably have Lauer leaning into that 5th spot a little bit. Burns, what have you seen from Burns since the return to camp?
I think Burns did enough in spring training itself to warrant some consideration. He was doing really well before all of the stuff that went down with coronavirus and the huge delay of the season. I haven't seen anything that points either way in the last couple weeks of the last week and a half or so of the summer camp stuff. So I don't know that you'll put him to start the year in the rotation, just given how much every game is going to matter, right? Given that he's sort of a wild card at this point, and year 1 was exceptional, year 2 was a disaster. So given that every game matters that much more, I'm not sure that you want to put him in those roles to begin with. So I might expect to see him coming out of the bullpen to begin with, just because he's a wild card until he can prove it, during a regular season game on the field.
Yeah, Peralta having a rough go of it right now. Don't put a ton of stock in these things, because I remember every spring how bad Ben Sheets looked. He'd open the season, he was always the opening starter, and he'd throw shutouts. I mean, it's like the guy just hit the switch, man. So Freddie's had questionable times, so it is a little concerning.
yeah, there's guys that, and they're guys that may have issues in this environment, right? They're guys that may need the crowd to pump them up more than some others. And, Freddie seems to be
Let's
kind
hope
of
that's not the thing here. Otherwise,
No,
Freddie's going to have a bad year, man.
Yeah, I know. You think that'd be more bullpen guys, like guys that aren't starters that might need that kind of stuff. You got the Trevor Hoffman coming out of the bullpen, Hader coming out of the bullpen. Those guys you might think need the hype in the crowd more than a starting pitcher. And Freddie, just given his wildness, you think maybe he sort of gets a little overexcited sometimes, and maybe it can be a calming situation potentially to be in a empty stadium. Though I know they started pumping the crowd noise tonight, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But I think I'd lean towards Freddie as a number 5 starter at this point, just based more on his winter ball performance. I mean, I know that spring training's been a little bit rough, but he's done well in many situations in the past. Maybe if you sort of piggyback him with a Burns, you have these two guys that can be sort of back-to-back starters within a single game, right? One on top of the other. I think we're going to see some odd things like that this year because we got a bunch of guys that can potentially go long. Even you throw Suter in there as a guy that could potentially go multiple innings, right? So we got plenty of guys that could, be 3-3 or 4-3, to get you through most of the game. And I think we'll see some more creativity in that regard this year, particularly since the rosters aren't going to be limited to 13 pitchers.
Okay, also on the long end of this not a starter for sure, but he's he was kind of bred as one, so he'd be more in a long relief role. You said this evening, Will, that Jake Faria not looking too good on the simulated game or whatever that was today, which is too bad. I really like the guy. I was happy when we made that trade. I thought I saw a lot of upside in Jake Faria, and he's kind of just hung out in the minor leagues ever since. I don't know what else he's looked like in camp because I haven't really looked at too many camp numbers closely. But yeah, it's too bad. What do you think? Was it that bad?
Yeah, so he gave up 4 runs in the first inning out tonight, really getting hit hard, kind of like what we saw at least in a few of his appearances last year. And I know I'm one to be cautious about making too many claims based on a single appearance because I also haven't seen too much of him prior to this. But it seems like he's, either telegraphing his pitches or they're not, not getting sufficient movement because he's really getting hit hard. He did get out of the second inning without giving up additional runs. So maybe there's some, maybe there's some room for optimism there. But I think when you look at all the other options that are out there and the guys that we have on the team, I think he certainly sort of pitched himself into the back end of that 13, 14, 15 man sort of rotating group that we're going to see throughout the year. If he comes on and does well, certainly can move himself back into it. But nothing I saw today would make me think that he's got a chance of having a key role, at least in the early part of the season for sure.
Yeah, I'm right on the edge with him. I mean, he makes the 60 for sure, but
Yep.
Counsell kind of said something that made you. I mean, he said he expected to have more pitchers on the roster than hitters. So with a 30-man, that means 16 or more. So that definitely well over the 13. I mean, I think if you get into 16, he's probably on the roster, at least at the beginning. But I don't know. I hope he can turn it around. I do.
And, I agree with you. I was someone that, obviously disappointed with how Aguilar's season went. Was sort of glad to get something seemingly intriguing back for him and Faria. But yeah, last year was a little bit disappointing with the performances we saw in the little bit of time he was up. And I hope he does well. As just like you, we're still a team that could use obviously some starting pitching help in the long run. And you're hoping he can sort of move into a starting role or sort of follow maybe the path like Adrian Hauser into a starting role eventually, but so far not seeing too much in that regard.
Yeah, that's kind of the far-reaching back end of the 5-slot battle here, which I think ultimately will be lowers, but we'll see. And the longer arms in the bullpen, so the top 4 in the rotation that we didn't dip into yet, Will. So I think, Woodruff is looking fine to me. He's ready to go. The Milwaukee hitters agree, it sounds like. So any disagreement that he's in good shape.
The advantage there is that in a 60-game season, obviously these guys have to pace themselves right through the course of a full 162-game year. We see a lot of pitching injuries happening in the midpoint and later in the season. Guys like Woodruff that can throw hard, I think for the entire 2 months plus and hopefully into the playoffs, he's a guy that can throw it hard the whole time. I mean, there's no need to hold back like you might do over the course of a 6-month regular season. So for a guy like him, I think that's a big advantage. I think he's a guy that sort of has to rein it in on occasion, but he doesn't necessarily have to do that here, as the season's short enough that there's not going to be, the dead arm potentially that we see in other years, or actual injuries that we often see for pitchers that are hard throwers. So I think we're seeing it in camp. I think he was, throwing as hard as ever. I think Kane said that it looked like 120 mile an hour fastball coming in there. Obviously not that fast, but obviously he's getting some good speed on the fastball to start the year. So definitely intrigued by Woodruff. And, if you think about anybody on the Brewers aside from Hader that could sneak into a Cy Young race in a shortened year, I think he'd be really the only other candidate out there. But really looking good. And again, don't want to put too much stock in a simulated game, but he was good throughout spring as well.
Brett Anderson, always kind of scary to me.
I think that, a lot of the rotation after Woodruff, right, is question marks. And we knew that going into actual spring training as well. He's a guy that's done decently in the past to some extent, but when you look at the spring training numbers this year, they weren't that good. Now he only got into 5 innings, but he gave up 5 runs in that time, and an ERA of 6. And he's just a guy that he's not a huge strikeout pitcher. And when you're not a strikeout pitcher, there's a bigger element of luck necessarily involved in your game, because when the ball's in play, no one has total control over what happens with it. And sometimes that works out really well. And when the proverbial luck is on your side, you can look like a Greg Maddux out there. When the luck's not on your side, you can have an ERA of 6 or 7. And the Brewers have had a lot of guys like that over the years. A lot of folks that we like to remember, as well as folks we like to forget. But a few years ago he had an ERA of 8. Last year he had a successful year with an ERA under 4. That's what you get. I think that's what we don't really know. It's sort of a luck of the draw to some extent. And I don't want to be too negative on him. Sometimes those ground ball pitchers are more fun to watch. They keep the game moving. I think Anderson's one of the fastest in terms of game time in the league. So there's that aspect, which can be intriguing to folks that want to see the game sped up a little bit. But yeah, it's really nothing this spring has given me sort of any reason to be either more pessimistic or more optimistic, sort of just typical of what you might expect to see from a Brett Anderson year.
So Adrian Hauser looking like a lot of upside after the way he finished last season. The little bit I saw in camp wasn't very good, so digging into the numbers on Hauser here, Will, what is he looking like?
Yeah, I think Hauser established himself to the extent last year that I think he's solid in the rotation, right? We're not going to worry about whether he needs to, impress during spring training to keep the job. I think that he didn't get into a lot of games in spring training. Again, we're basing all this on such small sample sizes and then these simulated games. I think during actual spring training, during the little bit we saw him, he actually did pretty well. Only gave up 1 run in 6 innings, 1 earned run. So I think he did enough to, maintain his spot. And I think he's probably slotted in, I would say, as the number 2 at this point. It's crazy. A couple of years ago, you never thought this guy was going to sort of improve as much as he has, but he's definitely reached the point where I think he's the second best starter on the team. And again, until we see something different with a small sample size we've had, I think he's done well enough to give us some optimism for sure.
I have a lot of hope here for Josh Lindblom. So I would say if he can hold the 3 spot, consider that a tremendous success. Brett Anderson might have even if he's having a good year for him, he wouldn't be hard to edge out for the 3 spot. So, and who knows who's going to come up from below. But if Lindblom can hold a solid 4 even, I guess I'd probably consider that a win. But he did not look very good in spring training. So has he turned around much in camp for you, Will?
No, I don't think I've seen much different here. I feel like we're saying that with a lot of guys, just because even if they're in a particular game, look good here. It's really hard to know, given the uniqueness of the situation, what we can even take away from this. For one thing, it's almost like starting spring training over, given the amount of time that they were off was 2.5 months. So you don't know if they're just working on getting their positioning right. You don't know if he's working on his, getting his arm angle right. So, it's hard to know what to take away from this, with the caveat we just spent time praising Woodruff. I think that was one guy I've seen really, be impressive so far in the camp, the summer camp here. But, Lindblom, I mean, just looking back to his Korean baseball career and the number of guys that we've seen come back to the U.S. and sort of remake themselves. You think of Mikolas for the Cardinals in recent years is one example. I mean, I have a lot of hope just based on that. When it seems like a lot of guys that go over there learn to get away from just trying to throw hard and learn to place the ball, learn to sort of paint the corners a little bit more, emphasize, that strikeouts aren't the only thing, even though, modern analytics say they are the only thing. But I think that I have a lot of hope for him just based on that. And I'd put more stock in his numbers in the KBO than I would in the spring training numbers. I think you're right. He's not going to be a superstar more than likely. But if he can hold down the number 3 role, I think we'd be in pretty decent shape for sure.
Probably a mediocre rotation overall at best.
I think mediocre. I mean, if we were ranking the rotations in the division, probably at the bottom. I'd have to say, actually, probably at the bottom. Yeah, you definitely put the Reds. You would definitely take the Cardinals. Even the Pirates, have some good starting pitching that I would argue is on par or probably above what we have. But the Brewers' benefit is, again, the ability to mix and match. Josh Hader, Knebel, folks coming out of the bullpen strong. That's where we can sort of shore it up. But I definitely would say, yeah, mediocre rotation after we get by Woodruff. And Woodruff can't sort of pull the whole 5-man rotation up to anything other than sort of the cellar dweller of the Central.
So elsewhere in the bullpen, we do have Brent Suter. You talked a little bit about him. He's another guy. I love Brent Suter, don't get me wrong, but just his style really worries me. It totally worked out last year, but I don't know. I'm always skeptical with him, but he can throw a lot of innings. He doesn't throw hard at all. So any additional words on Suter here, Will?
We got the Back to the Future video, so that's the most important. Most important aspect of Suter.
Yeah. He's always good
he's
in the
there.
videos.
He's the comic relief for the team, and no, I think you're right. I mean, when a guy throws slow, there's always the danger that people can learn to time him better, and I think his the speed of his delivery between pitches helps with that. It helps keep guys on their toes and keeps them from getting in a rhythm. I think that's also why he fits in well in the bullpen because, we all know that a couple of years ago when he was starting, by the third time through the rotation, or the third time through the order, he was getting hit pretty hard. So I think the bullpen is the best role for him. I'll be intrigued to see if he can keep that up. Obviously, he's probably not going to be able to keep up an ERA under 2 this year. But man, it'll be a great story if he does. And he is one of my favorite players to watch on the team. So I definitely root for him to keep it going.
Yeah, and one of my favorite guys here, most intriguing. I hope he works out. I'm big into Ray Black here, and his upside. It's kind of been underwhelming so far, at least with the control aspect of it. But I think he's a lock here in the bullpen, especially with the expanded rosters. So this guy throws well over 100, so he just needed some control. So what are you seeing from him here, Will?
Yeah, I think you're right. He's a lock. Anytime you have a guy you can throw it that fast, one of the fastest in the league in terms of his average velocity, yeah, it's just been a matter of control for him, and a lot of evidence so far suggests maybe he's made a little bit of progress in that regard. But I think he's always going to be wild. He's not going to be the backup closer, to Knable or Hader or anything of that nature. But as a guy who can come in, get a couple outs and, maybe change it up after Suter with somebody who's throwing it 100, I think that could be pretty intriguing to watch for. But it is a matter of the control. And I think in spring he was doing a better job of keeping it in the zone than he was in the previous year. But again, it'll be interesting to see with a guy like that. Here's a guy that could be affected, I think, by the lack of crowd, and maybe in a positive way again. That maybe he won't get so overhyped. Maybe that'll help him stay a little calmer. But it'll be interesting to see for sure.
All right, Alex Claudio back this year again, Will. I'm a little surprised they hung on to Claudio. Kind of always been the left-handed specialist, so he's a guy that saw a lot of 1-2 batters tops in an inning. The new rules put pitchers at a minimum of 3 batters here. Another thing that worries me a bit, but we'll see.
Yeah, I noticed Council last year was putting him in a little bit more in lengthier situations and having him face some right-handers. And a lot of us, including me, were like, why is he still in here? He's a lefty specialist. If you look at his actual numbers from last year, he's less effective against right-handed batters, but he's not some guy who's getting blown away against right-handed batters. He faced 130 at bats against right-handed batters, and the batting average against was 274. If you compare that to left-handers, actually they're pretty close. 137 against left-handers, batting average of 218. So he's definitely more effective against lefties, but he's not shown to be the guy, at least so far, that's going to get destroyed if he has to stay in there and face, left, right, left or something like that. So I think that's probably why they hung on to him. Obviously, you don't want to put him into situations where it's just going to be righties at the plate. But I think in a left, right, left, something of that nature, I think he could survive, particularly if it's not like the meat of the order. And that's my supposition as to why they kept him around. I don't know if Council was sort of, preparing him for this year, last year by giving him more of those chances against righties. But he's not as bad as we might think on initial impression. And I think I'm being pretty optimistic with the bullpen here, but I think that is a strength of the team. I think he can make it work, particularly when you can also put him in with 2 outs to get one more lefty out as well.
All right, so we have David Phelps, new to the Brewers this year, always been strong. Yeah, he'll be pretty close to the setup role here. Probably a lot of 5th, 6th inning action here for David Phelps, but a good, solid addition, I think, to the team.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the more intriguing sort of under the radar moves that the team made this offseason. Yeah, very effective guy. I think it's really an embarrassment of riches in the back end of the bullpen there when assuming Knable can come back to be something like him, himself previously, with him and Hader and Phelps, there really are going to be a lot of options. And as we, already alluded to with the expanded bullpen, those options can be, given a break, and there's some other guys that can slot in there as well. So that's not an area the team is going to struggle. And Phelps coming in, I think there's no reason to expect that he's going to, be much worse off than he was in his previous seasons. He hasn't really shown much drop off recently. So definitely a solid addition and someone we can rely on.
What about Devin Williams, Will? He probably slates into the top at least 13 or 13 to 15 pitchers here. So didn't read any stats on him from camp at all, or haven't heard any buzz. What's the word on Devin?
I can't say I've seen too much on him so far this during camp. I think if I look back at the spring training numbers, he was doing pretty well in spring training. I think you're right. I think he showed enough last year that he'll definitely get a chance in the top 13 to 15 to 16 or whatever we end up using, and certainly to the extent that there's a train back and forth to well, there won't be a train back and forth to Appleton. That's right. It's just players that won't be actually on the field. I think he'll certainly be in the mix there and get some appearances for sure.
So actually, this thing I'm looking at right now says that Jake Faria is actually a non-roster invitee. Is that correct? Was that a
Oh,
1-year trade deal last year?
I did not know that.
So maybe that's a mistake. This is right on the Brewers website here. This is their player pool, and he's starred, and that's what it says for starred guys. So if that's the case, I did not know that. So that is very interesting.
I did
So
not know that either. Yeah, how quickly he falls off the radar there.
yeah.
So
All right. So at the very back end, then we have says he's healthy, Corey Knebel. So I hope that is the case. Like I said last week, it's kind of tough for him because he did not get a rehab stint. He seems to be throwing well from all accounts right now. He says he's ready. The Brewers say he's ready. I don't know. I felt like they were going to have to ease him in, but it sounds like they're just going to go right for it with Corey Knebel this year. So fingers crossed. I think we're all big fans and have been waiting long for his return. So
I think the most interesting question is he going to get sort of the closer's role back? We've seen that obviously Counsell doesn't use a closer in a traditional way with Hader, but with Knebel, we sort of did see more often than not, him being used in a more traditional sort of way. So it'll be interesting to see, who gets those ninth innings. I know, if we go back to 2018, what worked so well is, we have Hader in the 7th and 8th, and then we have Knebel coming in the 9th. I don't know if, when we talk about questions around Knebel, if we'll want to start him off in those situations. But on the other hand, he often thrived in those situations. So in some ways, it might be the best thing for him. I don't know. What would you like to see? Would you like to see Knebel getting the late innings, or would you rather see Hader in those situations?
I think most people that objectively look at baseball would gotta believe Hader's best suited wherever you need him the most. And Knebel should be closing games probably because I agree with Will from last week. He's a right-hander. It just makes a little more sense as a closer. But you just feel like the way baseball is structured now and financial deals and other things that not being called the closer is basically a demotion for Hader at this point, right?
Yeah, I think we talked about this during the preseason, the preseason before COVID and everything. That Hader saves are a big factor when you go into arbitration. The arbitrators don't keep up with sabermetrics necessarily, and if you're looking to get a good deal in arbitration, you got to go to that saves number. And if Hader sees his saves drop off the map, that could potentially harm him next time when he goes to arbitration. So that is something that obviously he would want to consider. What the team would want to consider, I think, is probably another question. If anything, it could sort of help the Brewers if they can better argue that he's sort of not as impactful by having fewer saves in next year's arbitration. So I think, to some extent, the Brewers may have already burned some bridges with Hader with that arbitration process. We all heard that it was sort of a negative experience for everyone. It always is, but maybe more negative than most. So in that sense, I'm not sure how much they're going to be worried about his feelings on this. I think he understands the role that he was in before, sort of the high leverage guy. And I think that, even if feelings get hurt, I think that is probably the most effective system to go to. And Counsell's never shown much worry for helping guys get their numbers, I don't think.
I don't think they'd fight for this specifically, but something interesting I'd like to see out of maybe the CBO or CBA coming up here is it's time to value a guy like Hader as much or more than a closer, even though he probably shouldn't be a traditional closer. But
you could probably set up some objective standards, right? You could probably go into arbitration rather than just arguing over the numbers, set some benchmarks and things, bring in some of the good sabermetrics guys and have some quantifiable things for the arbitrators to go on rather than just who argues their case the best. So I think that would be something to fight for. I certainly haven't heard that that's something that's going to be argued about, but I think it's something that should be certainly considered.
Yeah, I agree. So I guess that's the pitching staff then. Couple guys maybe at the bottom here that have an outside shot of being seen at during the season if there's a large pitching pool early on, or there's some injuries or something. You got Bobby Wall and Eric Yardley and guys like that down in the bottom there. Shelby Miller apparently has been signed to at least the Appleton camp, so he will be sticking around at this point. But
somebody in the GM's office is intrigued by him, right? It's the third year in a row we've had him, right? So yeah, I guess they're trying to rediscover those Braves glory days of that one season. But yeah, it's interesting. They must see something there because they keep bringing him back to some extent.
Yeah. So before we leave pitching here and segue into the draft, what do you think about the idea that possibly, or I think very likely, we have a reliever win the Cy Young this year? I feel like with the small sample size, it makes perfect sense. You're not going to see that many. Well, I saw a stat yesterday that the last Cy Young winner to have less than 10 wins was like in the 1950s or something. So starters, if they have 10 wins, that is dang near going to be a perfect season for them. I mean, I know it's a 60-game season, so anything can happen. And why should we hold them to that number? But I just feel like it'll be a lot tougher for starters to impress in the voting process. I think relievers rarely win the Cy Young. There's been a few. Raleigh Fingers, as a matter of fact, won in a shortened season, so makes sense too. I just think you're going to see these guys a lot more than you're going to see starters. I mean, you usually do, but when you throw 162 games, it seems like you see the starters as much. But it's definitely not going to feel that way this time. I think a starter has a very uphill battle to win it this year. But I think it's very possible, we get probably a closer again here winning the Cy Young Award. I think the odds are good.
I think that's right. I think all the awards that are going by counting stats, when you think of MVPs, what are we going to expect? Well, it might be 15 home runs, right? That'd be a good season this year. And for a pitcher, it might be 6 or 7 wins. Now, we did see in the last couple of years with
Jacob deGrom
that there is a move away from worrying so much about wins, and that was kind of heartening to see that he was quantifiably the best pitcher, even though I think he only had 11 wins that year, 2 years ago. So there is a movement away from worrying about wins, so that sort of argues against a closer to some extent. There might be there seem to be more writers that are willing to quantify pitcher quality beyond that win column. On the same hand, how impactful is a closer going to be without that big saves number? If a team wins 30 games, what are we talking about for a number of saves? Maybe 15, 16, maybe 20 at the most saves for a closer. But on the other hand, I think you're right. I think a guy like Hader, these few guys out there that can pitch more than one inning, can be high leverage, can come in important situations, could potentially put up an ERA under 1. A guy like that pitching fewer innings, really, that's a possibility. I think there's as good a chance as any year. I think that, starters are going to have a slightly more difficult time because those pitching stats are going to look pretty meager with 10 or 11 starts at most. And if there's ever a year, this will be the year. But given that we're moving a little bit away from those counting stats in general to things like WAR and other ways of quantifying pitching, FIP and things of that nature, I think it's not a foregone conclusion that we'll see a closer like we might if this was happening in 1980.
All right. So overall, the 2020 Brewers draft, 5 picks. I think they got a pretty good one at the top here. So if you look at the 5, it's just being 5 picks is crazy when you think about it, the way baseball drafts are. But how do you grade the Brewers overall 2020 draft, Will?
I think, you start at the top, right? And I've seen, some rankings and some people make the case that the Brewers got the best steal of the draft by getting Garrett Mitchell down at number 20. And apparently it was his type 1 diabetes that pushed him down. kind of surprises me that's as much of a concern, given the ability that we have to control that these days. But I think that was a great pick. Some of the picks further on, like Freddie Zamora in the second round, a little bit more of a stretch. There's a little bit of a flyer there, and I think some of that is an element of trying to game the slot money system. Trying to make sure that you can sign some of the other guys for more money by paying less in the second round slot. But overall, I think it was an effective draft. When you compare it to like the Packers draft that everyone's pissed off about in the last few weeks, I think the Brewers got a pretty overall positive grade, particularly by getting a great pick at number 1 and a guy that we might see in the outfield here pretty soon. I don't think we'll see him this year, though. There are some people that are saying there's a chance that could happen this year, which would be pretty interesting. But really a good pick. And in a draft with only 5 rounds, that first pick being so good can sort of set the whole trend.
You'd have to say, I mean, right now the Brewers' 60-man team has 2 open slots. It's said that those are mostly held in case Stearns wants to pick up guys that get cut from other camps. He did say Mitchell was a possibility, that he wouldn't rule that out. I mean, I think, quite frankly, if we have a season where Mitchell has to play in this outfield, it's not going to be a pretty season. So
that's when we're on the track for the season not making, because I suspect there'll be a lot of COVID ILs if that's the case, for sure.
Yeah, and then at that point, what the hell do we have? So, yeah, Mitchell, a lot of people had him slotted as a top 10 pick. I think the average was 6. A lot of people thought he'd go around the 6-7 slot. The Brewers got him in the 20 hole. Apparently, the Brewers have been following this guy for a long time. He's had many interactions with them over the years. So they got their guy. He was still there when they picked, in a strange draft overall to begin with, when you look at some picks that were made just for flushes or whatever. But took a lot longer than everybody expected to sign him. He ended up getting a pretty nice contract. I think I read that he has the biggest signing bonus ever given to a first round pick for the Brewers. So yeah, pretty high on this guy, and it looks like they did get a definite steal here as the outfielder from UCLA comes out. So
yeah, I've seen comparables to Charlie Blackmon as a guy. He's a pretty speedy guy. Above average power. So definitely, if we can get a guy like Charlie Blackmon, who's been an effective player for years, obviously that'd be a great pick down at number 20. We need to work on rebuilding the farm system. We've been down for several years as we sort of had to sell off pieces in the playoff push the last few years. So I think this is a key piece in getting that process going. And I think just having him may help bump the Brewers up out of the basement from their draft rankings of previous years next time we see them.
All right, so yeah, in the second slot, probably what people consider the biggest reach for the Brewers, shortstop Freddie Zamora. And I will state, too, we had 2 outfielders, 2 shortstops, and the catcher. And the catcher actually was a catcher/shortstop. So you don't see that combo too often, but he is apparently drafted as a catcher. So Freddie Zamora, a shortstop out of Miami, kind of thought of as a reach a bit.
Yeah, so I think, we could potentially have an Arcia kind of guy here at the worst. I know we don't necessarily want to hear that, but definitely a guy who's good defense, and the offense is decent, but, being a 300 hitter in college, which is about what he was, is not the same as being a 300 hitter in the MLB, right, with the metal bats. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with him. Obviously, the hitting needs to be developed a bit more, but he appears to be a pretty elite defender, at least an above-average defender, and that's still important at the shortstop position, even as we emphasize offense more there. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Even though I'm a Florida State alum, I can stand another Miami guy on the team, though it'd be nice to get some FSU folks up here as well at some point. We've got Braun as another Miami on the team. So.
Then we got Xavier Warren, drafted as a catcher, who he caught in high school, but played shortstop all through college. So that's interesting. Switch hitter here. He's apparently got a cannon for an arm and a high on base percentage. So this one, another praised pick here by the Brewers.
Yeah, I think this was another solid pick, and you gotta, though I haven't seen him, you gotta imagine if he can play both shortstop and catcher, that he's pretty athletic, not one of the sort of slow lumbering guys that we often think of in the catching role. The on base percentage is definitely what jumps out there. As we think about the Brewers as a team that values the modern sort of Moneyball sense of things, getting a guy who can get on base, who's also solid defensively. I think that's a good pick as well, for sure.
All right, and then you kind of got the dice rolls at the bottom of outfielder Joey Wiemer from Cincinnati and Hayden Cantrell, another shortstop out of Louisiana Lafayette.
Yeah, I think what we see with Cantrell is we got a guy that's a fast guy. And also we go back to the number one pick. Also, speed is an important tool for him as well. So I think maybe there's some emphasis on getting speedy guys here, which wouldn't really be something the Brewers have done in the past.
Yeah, thank God. I hate those speedy guys against us, and we never have those speedy guys.
Yeah, so even if it's in a pinch hitting or a pinch running role, maybe this is something we can see in the future. But I think that's an interesting aspect of this draft this year, is trying to get a little bit more into the speed. The analytics kind of frowns upon stolen bases because it's so high risk. But there's also the argument that you have to go for what's undervalued, and if speed becomes undervalued, then it becomes more attractive from an analytics perspective as well. So as a guy that's a flyer to some extent in the fifth round, which isn't what you'd usually say in the baseball draft, when we have many more rounds, I think that's a solid risk to take for sure.
Who knows when these guys are going to see any action because of the minor league situation and the pandemic, of course. So a lot of wild cards here on when we'll see any of these guys.
So will we see Garrett Mitchell or Jordan Love first? That may be the question.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. One thing I wanted to ask you about as we get ready to pack it up here for the evening, Will, what did you think of the schedule?
One argument that I've heard that it doesn't really matter this year. There's no crowd. And therefore, it doesn't really matter where we split the games. That there's no one there to sort of make the road team feel uncomfortable. I try to do a little bit of digging into this, to see what is in fact home field advantage in baseball. And there is home field advantage in baseball. You go back to the 1910s to today, it's been about 46% of the time that the road team wins, which means there's like a 4 to 5% home field advantage. Some of the sort of folks that have looked into this say a lot of that is umpire bias, that umpires they may not try to intentionally, but they subconsciously bias their strike calls towards the home team. But some of that is also just building your team for the ballpark. The Brewers are a team that's built to fit Miller Park. You look at teams that play in big ballparks, they put a premium on pitching because you're not going to have a 50 home run hitter. And so I think that, when you look at the teams that have the biggest home field advantage, it's not necessarily the teams you think that have a raucous fan base. The team with the biggest home field advantage is the Rockies. They have the biggest difference in their winning at home and on the road. And while the Rockies have good fans, they're not a team that's known like the Yankees or the Red Sox for having some loud fan base that's really going to, influence the game. Other teams that are up there are like the Pirates, and the Pirates have a big sort of cavernous ballpark that's kind of unique in modern baseball. And obviously they're also not a team that's known for having a raucous, big fan base. So I think this is unfair. I think there's really no reason that I've heard for why this was done the way it was done. Yeah, you could maybe make an argument for 4 and 6 splits. I think the ideal situation would have been 5 and 5, in that way you are reducing travel as well. But if we're not going to see that, maybe 4 and 6. But I think there's more to home field advantage than just the crowd. And so when folks are out there saying this doesn't matter because there won't be a crowd, I think that's not really a defensible position. So I won't complain too much because I'm glad that we're going to have baseball starting here in a couple weeks, and I'll be glad to see it. But I would like to hear some solid explanation as to why this was done this way, because it does seem pretty unfair and unbalanced, and just for every team. Every team's playing unbalanced schedules for no apparent reason.
I believe with all fiber in my being that it is a huge advantage just to bat in the home slot. I think
exactly.
That's a huge advantage. So, yeah, I think we're pretty much on the same page with that, Will, because I'm with you. I am with you. So thanks, Will. It's been a nice chat here, Brewers, this evening. We'll probably get you back here in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk again, man.
Sounds good. We'll have some games to talk about by then, hopefully.
Indeed. So email the show, brewersrundown@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, @brewersweekly. Call or text the voicemail line, 608-535-9302. Go to where you subscribe to the podcast, please, and leave us a lofty star rating or a quick little review if you have a few more seconds. That's what helps us the most. We are not going to ask you for money, folks, ever here on the show, but just take a second and rate or review the show. That's a huge help to us. Thanks again. I'll be back here next week with somebody. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen, but we're going to keep this thing going weekly as best we can. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. My name, once again, Eric Madsen. You can find me on Twitter @Hazer75. And you can find me on any number of other podcasts on the Flicksation Podcast Network. Yeah, check me out there. Will, thanks again. What's in store? Are you still working from home, or what's going on?
Still working from home most of the time. I've been going into the office a little bit lately, though. Since I went to an event last week, I'm going to definitely social distance and take precautions this week until I know everything's good there. But yep, still working from home primarily. So,
all right, take it easy, Will. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks everybody for listening to the Brewers Weekly Rundown. We'll see you next time. Thanks everybody for listening to the Brewers Weekly Rundown. It is a 2020 production of the Flicksation Podcast Network. We will see you next time.